I dream I move, I dream I groove. Like Mike, if I could be like Mike. I wanna be like Mike. Like Mike, if I could be like Mike.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Backfired, an NBA history podcast about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions. My name is Lewis, and the theme of today's episode is the bad luck of Ri Myung-hun, a.k.a. Michael Ri, named after his idol, Michael Jordan, hence the intro music there. Now, Ri never played in the NBA, but he seemingly had a chance in the late 90s and early 2000s before geopolitical circumstances outside of his control slammed the door on his hoop dreams. You see, Ri is from North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and I'm super excited to get to do this episode because outside of basketball, North Korea is really one of my biggest interests. I'm currently reading The Invitation Only Zone by Robert Boynton, which is about the North Subduction Project, mostly of Japanese people. Super interesting and obviously very morbid stuff. But, you know, it's important to have interests outside of basketball, as I've discovered. But I found out about Ri when I was researching the Vancouver Grizzlies because they were mentioned as a possible landing spot for Ri, who was training in Canada in preparation for his potential NBA career. And the Grizzlies being a landing spot for him will make more sense once we get further into the episode. So, North Korea, for those who aren't as obsessed as I am, this is a very mysterious country. Outsiders know relatively little about what goes on there, and a lot of the intelligence that experts in Seoul and in Washington and elsewhere gather is from drawing conclusions based off of satellite images, horror stories from defectors, or reading between the lines from what's been published in the Rodong Sinmun, which is the state newspaper in North Korea. In December of 2011, the second Supreme Leader, Kim Jong-il, died of a likely heart attack. His 40-kilometer funeral procession leading him to his final resting place in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun was broadcast internationally, and one particular soldier among the thousands lining the streets of Pyongyang stuck out to a few people.
The mystery surrounding a giant soldier seen attending the funeral procession of Kim Jong-il.
This towering figure photographed at Kim Jong-il's funeral.
It turned out that this quote-unquote super soldier was none other than Ri Myung-hun. Ri was typically reported as being between like 7'8" and 7'10", but the Guinness Book of World Records officially measured him at 7'8.5", which made him the tallest person in the world for a while there. So naturally, he looked like, a poor Photoshop job as an intimidation tactic when surrounded by a group of like 5'5" soldiers. But once Ri was identified, his story was brought back into the spotlight. Newspapers across the United States and Canada had once been filled with coverage of his attempt to make it into the NBA. So I'll put this into context. By now, I think a lot of people are aware just how much the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, loves basketball. His friendship with NBA star Dennis Rodman has been covered relentlessly, especially in American media when Rodman brought several former NBA players to play an exhibition game against a team of North Koreans for the great successor's 30th birthday in 2014. With Kim Jong-un having been a teenager in the mid-90s and having spent some of his formative years living a semi-ordinary life going to school in Switzerland when Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls were a worldwide sensation, certainly his fandom makes sense. In fact, in a GQ article published in 2013, Kim Jong-il's personal sushi chef, who is a Japanese man who goes by the pseudonym Kenji Fujimoto, detailed the nature of his relationship with Kim Jong-un, describing himself as the future dictator's playmate between the ages of 7 and 18. One of the many delicacies that the chef was able to procure from Japan was VHS tapes of Chicago Bulls playoff games. But the current Supreme Leader wasn't the only one who enjoyed the game. There's evidence that Kim Jong-il was also a big fan of the Bulls, as well as the Bad Boy Pistons, the latter certainly making sense with the need for the leader of the small rogue state to come off as a macho man. Kim was such a big basketball fan that Rick Santorum, Pennsylvania's frothy former senator, once declared North Korea not to be as big of a threat on the world stage, even after a nuclear test, because, quote, Kim Jong-il doesn't want to die. He wants to watch NBA basketball, which, as the kids say, big mood. Evidence of his fandom dates back to at least 1991, when a small, unofficial delegation traveled from Pyongyang to Washington, D.C. for a conference about peace on the Korean Peninsula. One of those men was Ri Gun, who was an American intelligence expert for the regime, so he spoke English. And after attending the conference and having dinner, one of the members of the U.S. State Department, Jean Schmeil, went to the hotel room that the North Koreans were staying in for further discussion. But all of a sudden, Ri Gun said, "Oh, the Bulls are on. Hold that thought." And then just turned on the hotel room TV and watched the Bulls play the Cavaliers. And Schmeil said that instead of, U.S.-North Korea relations, they debated on whether the NBA should allow zone defense. Schmeil said that Ri Gun knew all the NBA players' nicknames. He knew the history. He knew the stats. He knew that Scottie Pippen was injured at the time. And he admitted, quote, "I get to watch games with the boss being Kim Jong-il, who wouldn't be in control of the country for another 3 years, but had been the heir apparent to his father, Kim Il-sung, for nearly 20 years. So now I'm going to bring in a bit player in NBA history named Tony Ronzone. He was, back in the late 90s, a scout who has worked in various roles in scouting and player development and basketball operations for the Mavericks, the Pistons, and the Timberwolves. His specialty as a scout was finding international players. He scouted players like Dirk Nowitzki, Darko Milicic, and Yao Ming, advocated for the Mavericks to trade for Steve Nash when he was barely being used on the Phoenix Suns. And then also when he was with the Mavericks, he was instrumental in making Wang Zhizhi the first Chinese NBA player. Now, like China would be with Wang Zhizhi and later Yao Ming, North Korea was obsessed with getting a player into the NBA. Multiple sources that I found while writing this episode suggested that Kim Jong-il had in mind something similar to ping pong diplomacy, which was the start of eventual U.S.-China diplomatic relations. And that began when an American table tennis player started getting to know the Chinese table tennis team. If North Korea could get a player into the NBA, they may soon be at least a little closer to where they wanted to be on the world stage. Not only would it open the door to diplomacy between Washington and Pyongyang, it would show the world that North Korea is not this horrible place to live. The citizens aren't being treated poorly by the leader. Look, they have a player in the NBA. They're a real country. It also would be kind of a dick measuring contest against both the South and Japan to produce the region's first NBA player. North Korea and Kim Il-sung in particular despise the Japanese empire. That was for good reason. I'll just leave it at that. And, as a basketball fan, of course, Kim wanted one of his countrymen to be in the league that he was obsessed with. Again, I can't underscore how much he loved the sport. Typically, it would come on at 9 or 10 in the morning in Pyongyang, so, he could watch it over his morning coffee. He did, of course, have access to Western media, unlike the regular citizens of his country. Tony Ronzone, and, we'll bring Tony back up a little bit later, but he had put on a handful of coaching clinics in North Korea, and he had brought a bunch of binders full of diagrams of motion offenses, defensive philosophies, inbound plays and ATOs, shooting drills, all that kind of stuff. Ronzone said, quote, "When I was leaving, they told me that the sports minister wanted copies of all my literature that I brought with me so they could have it as a reference. Later, my interpreter quietly told me that it really was for Kim Jong-il. He wanted to read through it all." And what's more, I found this story and I kind of just want to shoehorn it in here because it's kind of funny. On a trip to North Korea in 2000, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright gave Kim a basketball signed by Michael Jordan as a show of goodwill. And that basketball still resides in a museum north of Pyongyang called the International Friendship Exhibition, alongside various badass gifts from other beleaguered nations. It's very funny to me that this museum is full of model tanks from East Germany and various statues from Libya and Tanzania, and then there's just a signed basketball. But, all those things rule, so I would love to go there someday and see Stalin's limousine. But anyway, so Kim wants to get one of his countrymen into the NBA. So here's where Ri Myung-hun comes in. The first introduction that a lot of people had to him was an article that ran in a bunch of newspapers describing how big he was. And I love this opener, so I'm just going to read it. Quote, "He would look down at 7'7" George Mirashan, tower over 7'2" Dikembe Mutombo, and dwarf 6'10" Vitaly Potapenko. Ri Myung-hun is that big." Like I said, he's 7'8.5". That is absolutely gigantic. And I don't know if you've ever been in the same room as an NBA player, but you got to crane your neck up to look at him, basically, no matter how tall you are. I walked into a restaurant here in Memphis when James Wiseman was walking out, and James Wiseman is, I think, like 7'1". So then trying to imagine somebody who is like 7 inches taller than that is absolutely bananas. Ri was originally discovered by scouts in 1996 during the William Jones Cup, which is an annual basketball tournament held in Taiwan. North Korea's basketball team doesn't go to the Olympics, so Ri, their ace, was a secret until this tournament, on the world stage. He was so good that he made the all-tournament team, and he impressed the American coaches by scoring 29 points, including hitting a 3 and then hitting all 12 of his free throws. This was the first time that he'd gotten on any American's radar, but he had been a member of the North Korean national team since 1985 when he was 16, and he'd won the MVP of the 1993 Asian Basketball Confederation Championship in Indonesia. So within Asian basketball circles, he was kind of a known commodity. But after doing well against the American team, word got to him that he had a minuscule chance at making it into the NBA, which was his dream. But how could a North Korean man play in the United States? At the time, it was virtually impossible thanks to the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. This law and its 1933 amendment allowed the president to list or delist countries as enemies, which in effect here barred U.S. businesses from doing business with certain foreign nationals. Most of the 40-some-odd countries that have been listed under this act were from between 1941 and 1946, of course. But Harry Truman listed the DPRK as an enemy in 1950 at the start of the Korean War. So at the time Ri began his quest to play in the NBA in 1997, the North was one of 2 countries that still held that designation, the other one being Cuba. As a result, it was illegal for 27 of the 29 teams in the NBA to sign him, even if they wanted to. This act did not apply to the league's 2 Canadian teams, the Vancouver Grizzlies and the Toronto Raptors, but Commissioner David Stern forbade all 29 teams from making any contact with Ri. So that left 2 potential avenues that Ri could take to become eligible to play in the NBA. First, he could get special permission from the U.S. State Department, which was a long shot, to say the least. Or second, he could secure landed immigrant status. In other words, establish permanent residency in a country that is not considered an enemy of the United States. And so that is what he tried to do. In April of 1997, Ri traveled to Canada's capital of Ottawa, hoping to establish permanent residency there. If he were able to establish permanent residency and secure the necessary paperwork, that would allow Ri to legally play for any of the 29 teams if they wanted to sign him. Ri said that he would not even entertain the idea of earning a Canadian citizenship because he was outwardly proud of his homeland, but still, just in case, he was accompanied by a few minders, including a translator and a bodyguard, just to make sure that he didn't accidentally wander into the South Korean consulate and defect. But in addition to his minders from the DPRK, Ri was looked after by Wayne McKinnon and Michael Coyne of Evergreen Partners, which was an agency based in Cleveland. McKinnon, who was the president, wouldn't explain how the agency came to represent Ri, but he did arrange for 8 months of training for Ri under the former Canadian national team coach Jack Donahue, who had been Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's high school coach. And also, folks, I haven't done Freak of the Week for a couple of episodes because I forgot to do it, but Donahue is 100% the Freak of the Week. I've talked about guys editing their own Wikipedia pages before. Donahue has been dead for about 20 years, so he can't, but I'm sure that he would love to edit his Wikipedia page because it details just how racist he is. It's very rare to log on to wikipedia.org and just see the N-word with a hard R, but apparently it was not rare to hear Donahue use it. So Jack Donahue, you are the Freak of the Week. He was stationed in Korea during the Korean War, so it should come as no surprise that his nickname for Ri was a slur. Even worse that it was printed in basically every major newspaper in North America. But anyway, the estate of Jack Donahue, if you're listening, the prize is in the mail. Ri trained under Donahue because although he was good while playing against random college players in the Jones Cup and, against the Kuwait national team, he wasn't an NBA caliber player yet. He was tall, he was a good shooter, but that was about it. He didn't have an NBA body, he didn't have NBA nutrition, and he didn't have NBA stamina. So that was what Donahue and the nutritionists and the strength coaches that Evergreen brought in were for. When Ri arrived in Ottawa, he was about 240 pounds with 16% body fat, a 12-inch vert, and he could only squat 95 pounds. He desperately needed to bulk up so that he could survive in the posts on either end of the floor. And also, when I say that he was 240 pounds, for reference, George Mirashan, the 7'7" Romanian center for the Washington Bullets, played at around 300 pounds, and when Yao Ming came into the league, he played at about 310. So he worked on his body, he worked on his skills, and he held out hope that his agents would come through in attempting to lobby the State Department to grant him an exception, because the route of establishing himself as a permanent resident in Canada did not work out. In November of 1997, David Stern allowed teams to scout Ri, but still wouldn't allow the two Canadian teams to offer him a contract. No one would be allowed to until the State Department allowed it, but essentially, Ri had the green light once he was approved. Both Canadian teams did send scouts to Ottawa to check out Ri's progress, but they left unimpressed. Grizzlies scouting director Larry Riley called Ri a 3-year project, and their general manager Sue Jackson publicly denied any interest. Jim Kelly, the scouting director for the Raptors, simply said that Ri had a long way to go. And really, even though he'd improved his body by a lot in the short time he'd been in Canada, his vertical was higher, he'd gained 40 pounds and cut down on his body fat percentage. Even though all that was true, Marty Blake, who was a major scout for the Atlanta Hawks and later the league office, said, quote, "Here's a guy who wasn't very good with the North Korean team that's all of a sudden become a Superman in hiding." But the other teams did their due diligence, and they came to a different conclusion from Blake and the two Canadian teams. He may have been slow, he was approaching 30, and he came with a lot of baggage, but he did have what it took in their eyes. According to Detroit Pistons scouting director Walt Perrin, there were a handful of teams that would take a flyer on him with a minimum contract if they were allowed to. Chuck Daly, formerly the coach of the Bad Boy Pistons and at the time the coach of the Orlando Magic, said, quote, "It is my impression that he can play in the NBA. His size and skills indicate that he could have a long career in this league." Teams likened Ri to Rick Smits of the Indiana Pacers. He was giant, had a soft shooting touch, and he could hit his free throws. At the end of his 8 months of training, so in January of 1998, Ri went back to North Korea to wait for progress on the State Department allowing him to work in the United States. In the meantime, he served in the military. By June of 1998, Eric White, who was a lobbyist and Clinton campaign official, had successfully sold 30 members of Congress on supporting Ri on behalf of Evergreen, which was a good sign. White got senators on both sides of the aisle on board. Barbara Boxer, a Democrat from California, as well as Connie Mack, a Republican from Florida, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright vouching for Ri, where they said, quote, "We believe that allowing Mr. Ri to play basketball in the United States will have a positive impact on relations between our nations by showcasing the benefits of a free and open society to a North Korean hero." In addition, South Korea's new president, Kim Dae-jung, would be speaking at a joint session of Congress that same month to urge the United States to lift the sanctions that they had on the DPRK and establish diplomatic relations with them. Nike was also pushing to get Ri into the league. Per NK News, which is not state media, it's a Seoul-based organization that covers North Korea. According to them, Nike had inked Ri to an endorsement deal in May of 1998 and maintained some manufacturing in North Korea. I'm not sure how that was allowed under the Trading with the Enemy Act, but, got to get those cheap sneakers, I guess. In September of 1998, CNN is visiting North Korea, and Mike Shinoy, who was the senior Asian correspondent for CNN, saw Ri, and Shinoy and CNN were not there to do a story on him, but they wound up doing that. They interviewed him and effectively kept him in the spotlight for a little longer. During his interview, Ri says, quote, "I thought if I could play in the NBA, it would contribute to friendly relations between my country and the U.S., but my efforts have had the opposite effect." He continued, quote, "The NBA agreed for me to play, so did the U.S. Commerce Department, but the State Department waited for 6 months and then said no. They wanted to use me for political purposes, so I just gave up. I'm a big man. I want to test my ability. I'm not interested in money or politics. As a sportsman, I just want to try." So he's in a holding pattern for months, which turns into a couple of years, and he's just serving in the military and playing in exhibition games with mixed teams from the North and the South, still training, but not under the guidance of a seasoned veteran coach or trainer like Donahue was. Finally, 3 years after he came to Canada for the first time, Ri catches a break. In the year 2000, there's an inter-Korean summit for the first time since the Korean War, so 50 years. The president of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung, travels to Pyongyang for a 3-day summit that culminated in a joint declaration and eventually some separated families in the South and the North being reunited. Now, what I'm about to say isn't relevant to Ri at all, but it did later come out that South Korea paid North Korea $500 million in secret to do this summit. This was a major scandal back in 2003 when this was all discovered. Kim Dae-jung essentially facilitated a $500 million payment to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Just insane. But the effect for Ri was that although Washington and Pyongyang had not established relations officially and North Korea would remain under trading with the enemy designation, Ri was going to be allowed into the United States. The State Department had finally approved him. He could train there under professional supervision again, and he could sign for whatever NBA team he wanted out of those that made contract offers for him. It was the chance of a lifetime. The only stipulation was that he could not remit his salary back to North Korea. Now, for years, he'd been asked by South Korean journalists in Canada whether he planned on sending money back to the North or whether he even had a choice in the matter. He never took the bait on political questions. He always went with no comment or simply said that the money he was going to make was going to belong to him, so what he did with that money wasn't going to be anybody's business. Well, it turned out that the only stipulation for Kim Jong-il to allow Ri to play in the NBA was that his salary be sent back to North Korea, of course. And this is where Tony Ronzone comes back in. He had traveled to North Korea a couple of times, so he went back and he actually, I'm not sure if this was on behalf of Dallas Mavericks, who he was working for, or on behalf of the league as a whole, but Ronzone claims to have bartered with Kim Jong-il directly. And the deal that they came to was that no money had to be sent to the North, but whatever team wanted to sign Ri would have to send an equivalent sum of money to North Korea in wheat. This was in the period of time known as the Arduous March, which was a years-long famine in North Korea. There was flooding, there were droughts, domestic food production took a hit. The Soviet Union had fallen years before. They had supported the North in various ways. Russia's president, Boris Yeltsin, preferred the South to the North, so it wasn't until Vladimir Putin became the president that Russia would resume supporting them. So there were a bunch of factors that led to this famine. I'm not an expert or historian, obviously, so I don't know everything that happened leading up to the famine or during the famine, but I do know that Kim Jong-il would have loved to get some more wheat, so that is ultimately what he asked for from Ronzone. Here's one. I've heard of a cash crop, but this is ridiculous. So stupid. Anyway, that deal obviously wasn't going to work. That was essentially paying North Korea, which was a no-go. So Kim said, no, it's not going to happen. The North has got to have some recompense here. So suddenly the door was shut for Ri Myung-hun. He would never play in the NBA. Robert Carlin, who was the chief North Korea analyst for the CIA and the State Department, later said, quote, "We didn't handle Ri as wisely as we should have. This was the time when the DPRK was genuinely trying to improve relations with the United States. I think they wanted to show the American people that this enmity and hostility was thawing because one of their Koreans was playing amongst the Americans." Now, Ri obviously had to be devastated privately, but he put on a brave face, and in what may have been his final interview to the outside world, he said, quote, "It's my honor to play games in the bosom of the general. Why do I need to go somewhere else to play?" And I don't know, man, it's just sad. You know, this is a guy who didn't ask to be born in North Korea. Instead of playing against the world's best basketball players night in and night out, he had to stay in a country where, you know, he probably was treated really well. You know, I'm sure he's royalty there, but he wasn't being pushed to the limit every day. And what's worse is that after getting the taste of real freedom during his 8 months in Canada and earning sponsorship money from Nike, he had to go back and be told on what conditions he could leave. And ultimately, it wasn't his decision to stay back in the North. He got a real contract offer from a team in Turkey, but Kim said he's not letting Ri go to Europe. It's the United States or nothing. Kim, you know, wasn't trying to end 50 years of sanctions that had been levied against his country by Turkey. So, you know, If Ri had been born across the Yalu River in Shenyang, or across the Sea of Japan in Tokyo, or across the demilitarized zone in Seoul, he probably would have been the first Asian NBA player. He could have been posting up Shaq 4 nights a year and making hundreds of thousands of dollars, but he wasn't. He just wasn't lucky enough. And even if you're pushing 7'9" and can hit 80% of your free throws and are deemed to be NBA ready by scouts and coaches, you still got to have a little luck on your side. So that is the episode. I hope you enjoyed. I certainly learned a lot and got to nerd out over my 2 favorite subjects. It's always good to get to push 2 of your interests together like this. So greatly appreciate you listening. I hope you'll come back. As I'm recording this, free agency starts in like 18 hours. So that's awesome. Yeah, next week we'll discuss something a little less geopolitical. How about that? Please follow the socials at Backfired NBA Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. At Logic Master with a 0 in place of the O is my Twitter. Rate, review, follow, subscribe, whatever you want. I'd appreciate it, but no one's forcing you. Hey, folks, we're not in North Korea. You can do whatever you want. Anyway, that'll do it for me. Thank you again for listening, and yeah, have a good one.